Her power supply has been disconnected, sir, the bodyguard told the Mafia boss, his voice low, careful, the way a man speaks when he already knows the answer will not be liked. Yoon Tae-min did not look up from the folder in his hands. "Did you pay off the electricity bill?" he asked, not even glancing at the man standing rigid by the door. "No, sir. You told me to watch her, not to interfere." Tae-min's jaw tightened. Outside the tinted window of his penthouse, Seoul glittered gold and blue, a city of a million lights, a million people who never had to think about whether their lights would come on when they flipped a switch. And somewhere in that city, in a cramped one-room apartment above a shuttered noodle shop, Nancy Adeyemi was sitting in the dark. He closed the folder. "Get me her account number." "Sir." "No." The bodyguard, a man named Suk-ho who had served the Yoon family for over a decade and had learned when to push and when to disappear, chose to disappear. He left the room without another word. Tae-min stood at the window a long moment, his reflection ghosted over the skyline, his hands in his pockets, his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to worry. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was just a woman he'd hired to translate documents for his legitimate business front 3 months ago, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, a woman who had looked him dead in the face during their first meeting and told him his Korean to English contract had a clause that would get him sued in international court. He'd been furious. Then he'd been impressed. Then he'd been, God help him, something else entirely. He told himself it was nothing. He was already lying to himself, and he knew it. Across the city, Nancy sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her phone at 4% battery, the screen the only light in the room. She held it like a lifeline because it was one. Her sister back in Lagos had been trying to reach her for 2 days, and Nancy had no way to call back, no way to explain that she'd fallen behind on the bill again because the translation agency had cut her hours, again, and rent had eaten everything, again. "Come on," she whispered to the phone, as if it could hear her, as if pleading might squeeze 1 more percentage point of battery out of thin air. "Just let me call her. Just one call." The apartment was cold in the way only powerless apartments in early spring could be cold. Not brutal, but persistent, seeping into her bones through the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She thought about calling her landlord to beg for 1 more week. She thought about calling Tae-min's office to ask if her next paycheck could come early, and then she laughed, alone, in the dark, at the absurdity of it. She would rather freeze than ask that man for anything. It wasn't that he was cruel to her. If anything, that would have been easier. It was the way he looked at her sometimes, across the conference table, like he was trying to solve an equation he couldn't quite finish. It was the way he'd once caught her crying in the stairwell after a call from home and hadn't said a word, just stood there, silent, until she composed herself, and then handed her his own handkerchief before walking away without waiting for thanks. She didn't trust kindness from men like him. Kindness from a Mafia boss always had a price. She just hadn't figured out what his was yet. Her phone buzzed. 2%. "No, no, no," she sat up straight, and the screen lit with her sister's name, and she answered so fast she nearly dropped it. "Nancy." Adey's voice crackled through, relief and worry tangled together. "Why haven't you been answering? I've called 20 times. I know, I'm sorry, my phone's about to die, the power's out." "The power's out? Again?" "Nancy, this is the 3rd time this year." "I know." Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated herself for it, hated how tired she sounded, how close to breaking. "I'm handling it." "You don't sound like you're handling it." "Adey's, please, I don't have much battery, just, tell me about home. Tell me something good." Her sister sighed, the kind of sigh that meant she was letting it go for now but not forever, and began telling her about their mother's garden, about the new baby next door, about small good things happening 4,000 miles away in a world that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Nancy closed her eyes and let herself pretend, just for a minute, that she was there instead of here, warm instead of cold, safe instead of. The screen went black. "No," she stared at the dead phone in her hand, and something in her chest caved in, quiet and total, the way a building collapses not from an explosion but from years of small cracks nobody fixed. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there in the dark, phone in her lap, and let the cold settle into her like a second skin. She didn't know that 3 kilometers away, a man was standing over a laptop with her account number pulled up on the screen, staring at the overdue balance, a number that would mean nothing to him and meant everything to her, and that his hand hovered over the payment button for a full 30 seconds before he clicked it. She didn't know that he then closed the laptop, sat back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling of his penthouse like a man who had just done something far more dangerous than any contract killing he'd ever ordered. Because feelings, in his world, got people killed. And he had just paid to keep a woman's phone charged. "Sir." Sukho's voice came through the intercom. "The payment went through. Anonymous, like you asked. She won't know it was you." Tae-min didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the way she'd looked at him across the table 2 days ago, exhausted, guarded, brilliant, and how badly he wanted to be the kind of man she could look at without that guard up. "Good," he finally said. "Keep it that way." But even as he said it, some part of him, some reckless, foolish part he thought he'd buried years ago when he took over his father's empire, already knew that keeping it that way was going to be impossible. Nancy woke the next morning to sunlight through her window and the low hum of her refrigerator, a sound so ordinary it took her a full 10 seconds to understand what it meant. The power was back on. She shot out of bed, heart pounding, and checked her phone. It was charging, the little lightning bolt icon blinking steady and sure on the screen. She checked her banking app next, hands shaking slightly, expecting to see the balance drained from some emergency reserve she didn't remember having. The account showed the electricity bill, paid in full. Yesterday, 11:47 p.m. She hadn't paid it. "What?" she said aloud, to no one, to the empty apartment. "What is this?" She called her landlord first, certain there'd been some mistake, some clerical error in her favor that would surely be corrected by an angry phone call within the hour. But her landlord, gruff and half asleep, only confirmed what she already knew. The payment had gone through, in full, processed by the utility company directly. No error. No refund pending. Someone had paid her bill. Someone she didn't know, or someone she did. She thought of her sister first, but Adeyemi barely had money for herself, let alone to wire funds across the world without saying anything. She thought of her mother, and dismissed that even faster. She thought of co-workers, of the translation agency, and came up with nothing that made sense. And then, unbidden, uninvited, she thought of him. No, she told herself, shaking her head as she pulled on her coat for work. Absolutely not. Why would he even think of something like that? He doesn't even know I've had my power cut before. But she remembered the stairwell. She remembered the handkerchief. She remembered the way his eyes tracked her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, careful and unreadable and far too intense for a man who was supposed to be nothing more than her employer. She told herself it wasn't him. She told herself it all the way to the office, and she was still telling herself when she stepped into the elevator and found him already inside, alone, dressed in black, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Good morning, Miss Adeyemi," he said, his voice even. "Good morning," she answered, watching him too closely now, searching his face for something, anything, that might give him away. He gave her nothing. He never gave her anything. But as the elevator doors slid shut and the silence stretched between them, thick and charged, Nancy felt something she couldn't name settle low in her stomach. A suspicion, a hope, a fear, all tangled together into one impossible question she didn't dare ask out loud. "Was it you?" The elevator hummed between floors, and Nancy studied the numbers ticking upward instead of looking at him, because looking at him felt dangerous right now, felt like she might blurt out the question sitting on the tip of her tongue. "You seem distracted this morning," Tae-min said, breaking the silence first, which he almost never did. "Do I?" She kept her eyes on the doors. "I had a strange night." "Strange how?" She glanced at him then, just briefly, just to see if anything flickered across that carved, composed face of his. Nothing did. "My power came back on. Someone paid the bill. I don't know who." For half a second, so brief she almost missed it, something shifted behind his eyes. Then it was gone, smoothed over so completely she wondered if she'd imagined it. "That's fortunate," he said simply. "Fortunate," she repeated, and something in her chest tightened. "Yes, I suppose it is." The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor before she could say anything else, and he stepped out first, leaving her standing there a moment longer than necessary, her heart doing something complicated and unwelcome. She didn't ask him directly that day. She told herself she was being paranoid, that a man like Yoon Tae-min, a man whose name made grown gangsters lower their eyes, a man who controlled half the shipping routes through the Yellow Sea and more of Seoul's underworld than the police would ever officially admit, did not spend his evenings paying random utility bills for his translator. But she watched him. All day, in every meeting, every hallway crossing, every moment his gaze happened to land on her a fraction too long before he looked away. By the time she got home that evening, exhausted, her mind still turning the mystery over and over, she found a small paper bag hanging on her doorknob. Inside, a portable phone charger, brand new, still in its box, and a single folded note. In case it happens again. No name. No signature. Just 6 words in handwriting she recognized instantly, because she'd seen it scrawled across contract margins a dozen times. Sharp, slanted, economical, exactly like the man who wrote it. Her hand trembled as she held the note. "Oh my God!" she whispered into the empty hallway. "It was you." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the new charger sitting on her nightstand like evidence in a case she hadn't asked to investigate, and she turned the same thoughts over and over until dawn. Why would he do that? Men like Tae-min did not do small, quiet, anonymous kindnesses. Men like him dealt in leverage, in power, in favors that always came with strings attached. She'd read about his family in the news before she ever took the job. The Yoon syndicate, 3 generations deep in Seoul's underworld, rivals who disappeared, warehouses that burned, judges who suddenly found reasons to rule in their favor. She knew exactly what kind of man she worked for. So why did paying her electricity bill feel like the most dangerous thing anyone had ever done to her? She marched into the office the next morning with her resolve steeled, prepared to confront him, to demand an explanation, to tell him she didn't need his charity and didn't want whatever complicated thing was clearly starting to grow between them. She didn't get the chance. The moment she stepped off the elevator, she could feel it, the tension in the air, sharp and electric, security personnel moving faster than usual, voices low and urgent. "What's happening?" she asked one of the assistants, a young woman named Ji-eun who always seemed to know everything before anyone else. "Someone broke into the Cho warehouse last night," Ji-eun whispered, eyes wide. "Chairman Yoon's furious. They think it's the Beck family. There's a meeting happening right now, closed doors." Nancy's stomach dropped, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She barely knew the details of Tae-min's business. She translated contracts, not blood feuds, but the name Beck made something cold slide down her spine. She'd heard Suk-ho mention them once, in a tone reserved for genuine threats rather than mere rivals. She spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on work and failing entirely, her mind circling back again and again to the closed door of the boardroom, to the muffled voices she couldn't quite make out, to the charger sitting uselessly at the bottom of her bag because she hadn't had the nerve to bring it up yet, hadn't had the nerve to say thank you or why or what does this mean. It was nearly 6 in the evening when Tae-min finally emerged, his face harder than she'd ever seen it, his eyes shadowed with something that looked, for just a moment, like exhaustion. "Ms. Adeyemi." He stopped in front of her desk. "A word. My office." "Of course." She stood, smoothing her skirt, her heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with warehouse break-ins and everything to do with a note still folded in her coat pocket. His office was all glass and dark wood, cold and precise, exactly like the man who occupied it, except for the small, unexpected detail she noticed the moment she stepped inside. A space heater, tucked discreetly in the corner near the window, running low but running nonetheless, in a room that was already perfectly climate-controlled. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You didn't need to come here for a scheduling matter," she said quietly. "Did you?" He was silent for a long moment, standing near the window with his back half turned, the city lights glinting off the glass. "No," he admitted finally. "I didn't." "Then why?" "Because I needed to see that you were all right." His voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it trembled, just barely, just enough for her to hear. "There's a war starting, Nancy. A dangerous one. And I have enemies who would love nothing more than to find out there's someone I'd burn the whole city down to protect." Nancy's breath caught. "Someone like who?" Tae-min turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd known him, his composure cracked completely, raw and unguarded and terrified in a way she'd never imagined a man like him could look. "You," he said. "It's you, Nancy. It's always been you." The words hung in the air between them, and Nancy felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt every guarded wall she'd built since the day she'd walked into this office start to crack at the foundation. "No," she said, shaking her head, taking a step back even though some traitorous part of her wanted to step closer. "No, you don't mean that. You can't mean that." Why can't I? His voice rose, frustration and something rawer bleeding through the careful control he wore like armor. Do you think I don't know how dangerous this is? Do you think I haven't spent 3 months telling myself to stay away from you, to treat you like every other employee, to bury whatever this is before it gets either of us killed? Then why didn't you? Her own voice cracked now, betraying her. Why the charger, Tae-min? Why the electricity bill? Why did you come find me the moment there was danger instead of sending Suk-ho like you always do? He crossed the room in 3 strides, closing the distance she tried to put between them, and stopped so close she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the sleeplessness, the weight of a war he was fighting on 2 fronts now, one with guns, one with his own heart. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you sitting in the dark, he said, quieter now, almost broken. Because I paid that bill at midnight like a coward, anonymously, telling myself it meant nothing, and then I stood at my window for an hour afterward feeling more alive than I have in years over something as small as knowing your lights were back on. Nancy's eyes burned. That's not small to me, she whispered. Do you understand what it's like, being cold in a city that isn't yours, being invisible to everyone except when they want something from you? Nobody has ever. Her voice broke entirely. Nobody has ever just taken care of me without wanting something in return. I don't want anything from you. He reached up, hesitant, and brushed a tear from her cheek she hadn't even realized had fallen. I just wanted you warm. I just wanted you safe. I would burn every enemy I have to the ground before I let anything touch you, and that terrifies me more than the Beck family ever could. Tae-min. I know what I am, he said, cutting her off, his hand still cupping her face like she was something fragile and precious in a world built entirely of concrete and blood. I know what my name means to people. I know the things I've done, the things I'll still have to do. I have no right to ask you to want any part of this. But I'm asking anyway, because I don't think I can keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. Nancy stood there, torn between every instinct screaming at her to run and the terrifying, undeniable pull drawing her closer instead. She thought of her sister's warnings, of the news articles, of every rational reason this was a catastrophic idea. And then she thought of the charger on her nightstand. The note in her pocket. The way he'd looked at her like she mattered more than the empire he'd built his entire life around. This is insane, she breathed. Completely, he agreed. I could lose everything getting involved with you. My safety. My visa status. I know. My heart, she finished, so quietly it was barely more than a breath. Something in his expression shattered open at that, raw and unguarded, and before either of them could think better of it, he closed the last inch of distance between them and kissed her, slow at first, questioning, like he expected her to pull away, and then deeper when she didn't, when her hands found the front of his shirt and pulled him closer instead of pushing him back. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tae-min rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. I need you to understand something, he said, his voice steadier now but no less intense. If this is real, if you choose this, choose me, there's no undoing it. My enemies will use you against me the moment they find out. I need you to know exactly what you're stepping into. Nancy closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands against her skin, feeling something in her chest that had been cold and guarded for far too long finally begin to thaw. I've been cold and alone in this city for 2 years, she said. I think I'd rather burn than keep freezing. He kissed her again at that, fierce and certain, and for one suspended moment, the war outside the glass walls of his office felt very far away. It wouldn't stay far away for long. 3 days later, Nancy received a package at her apartment with no return address, a single black rose and a photograph of herself walking to work that morning, time-stamped, unmistakably surveillance. Written on the back, in handwriting that was not Tae-min's, he can't protect what he doesn't know is already ours. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her phone calling him. Tae-min, she gasped the moment he picked up. Someone's been watching me. They sent me a photo, this morning, they know my route, they know. Stay exactly where you are. His voice went ice-cold, commanding, the voice of a man who ran an empire and had just been told someone dared touch what was his. Lock your door. I'm sending Suk-ho now, and I'm coming myself right after. Tae-min, I'm scared. I know, he said, and for just a moment, the fear in his own voice matched hers. "I know, love. But I promise you, whoever did this will regret ever learning your name." The line went dead, and Nancy sat alone in her apartment, the black rose on the table before her, the photograph beside it, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Tae-min's warning had not been an exaggeration. The war had already found her. Suk-ho arrived within 11 minutes, gun holstered but visible beneath his jacket, 2 other men flanking him as they swept the apartment before allowing Nancy to move from the corner she'd retreated to. "Chairman Yoon is 15 minutes out," Suk-ho said, his usual composure replaced by something tighter, more alert. "Pack a bag. You're not staying here tonight." "Who did this?" Nancy's voice shook as she shoved clothes into a duffel with trembling hands. "The photo, they know where I live, they know my schedule." "The Beck family has been watching the chairman's movements for weeks," Suk-ho admitted, checking the window before continuing. "We didn't think they'd made the connection to you yet. We were wrong." "How wrong?" Suk-ho's silence answered before his words did. "Wrong enough that the chairman is going to want you somewhere with round-the-clock security starting tonight." Tae-min arrived exactly 14 minutes later, and the moment he walked through her door, Nancy felt something in her chest crack open at the sight of him. Not the composed businessman from the office, not even the raw, vulnerable man from 3 nights ago, but something harder, colder, a version of him she'd only glimpsed in rumors and news articles. "Show me," he said, and Suk-ho handed over the photograph and the note without a word. Tae-min read it once. His jaw tightened. He read it again, and Nancy watched something dangerous settle into his eyes, a stillness that felt far more frightening than shouting would have. "Kang Ho-jin," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You know who sent it?" Nancy asked. "I know exactly who sent it." He set the photograph down with deliberate care, as though handling something that might otherwise shatter beneath his grip. "Ho-jin runs the Beck family's Seoul operations. We've been circling each other for territory for 6 months. He's smart, patient, and until now, he's kept things professional." His eyes met hers, and the fury banked there made her breath catch. "This isn't professional anymore. This is personal." "What does that mean?" "It means he's found my weak point," Tae-min said, and though his voice stayed level, she could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "And he intends to use it." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and for a moment the fear in her chest loosened just slightly, comforted by the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I'm taking you to the estate tonight," he murmured into her hair. "It's the most secure property I own. You'll have guards, you'll have everything you need, and Ho-jin will not get within a mile of you. I swear it." "And if he does," she whispered. "Tae-min, what if this gets worse?" He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb brushing along her jaw with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the hardness still simmering in his eyes. "Then I'll end it," he said simply. "Whatever it takes." The estate, when they arrived, was nothing like she'd expected. Not the gaudy fortress of a crime lord, but a quiet, elegant compound tucked into the hills outside the city, guarded discreetly but thoroughly, every window fitted with reinforced glass she only noticed because Tae-min pointed it out himself. "You'll be safe here," he told her as they walked the halls, his hand never leaving the small of her back, as though he needed the constant contact to reassure himself she was really there, really safe. "I have men on every entrance. Nobody gets near you without going through 6 layers of security first. And you." She stopped, turning to face him fully. "Are you safe?" Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd think to ask about him in the middle of a threat aimed at her. "I've survived worse than Kang Ho-jin," he said. "That's not an answer." He exhaled, and for a moment the weight of everything he carried showed plainly on his face. The empire, the enemies, the constant vigilance that came with a life built on power and blood. "I'll be careful," he said finally. "For you, I'll be careful." That night, Nancy lay awake in the unfamiliar bed of a guest room too large and too silent, her mind spinning through everything that had happened in the span of a single week. A paid electricity bill, a hidden charger, a confession she hadn't expected, and now a threat that had turned her entire life inside out. She heard the door open softly sometime past midnight and found Tae-min standing in the doorway, still dressed, clearly having not slept at all. "I couldn't sleep either," she admitted before he could say anything. He crossed the room without a word and sat on the edge of the bed, and she reached for his hand in the darkness, lacing her fingers through his. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "Tell me this isn't going to end with one of us dead." His grip tightened around hers. "I won't let it," he said, and though she knew he couldn't promise something like that with any real certainty, not in his world, not against a man like Ho-jin, she chose, in that moment, to believe him anyway, because the alternative was letting the fear win, and she was done letting fear run her life. "Stay," she whispered. "Just stay here tonight. I don't want to be alone." He didn't hesitate. He toed off his shoes, lay down beside her fully clothed, and pulled her against his chest, and for the first time since the photograph arrived on her doorstep, Nancy felt something close to safe. She didn't know that across the city, in a penthouse suite far less elegant than Tae-min's estate but just as heavily guarded, Kang Ho-jin was staring at a second photograph, this one of the estate itself, security routes marked in red, already planning his next move. He had found Tae-min's weakness. Now he intended to use it. Kang Ho-jin poured himself a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, staring instead at the photograph spread across his desk, the estate's perimeter, the guard rotations his men had mapped over 3 sleepless nights, the small gap in coverage near the eastern garden wall where the hillside made cameras less reliable. "You're certain about this weakness of his?" asked the man seated across from him, one of Ho-jin's lieutenants, a wiry man named Deok-soo who had spent the last month tailing Tae-min's movements. "I watched him hold her like she was made of glass," Ho-jin said, swirling the whiskey without drinking it. "Yoon Tae-min has never once, in all the years I've known of him, looked at anything the way he looks at that woman. Not money. Not power. Nothing." He set the glass down with a soft click against the desk. "He'll trade the whole city for her if it comes to it. That's not weakness, Deok-soo. That's a door standing wide open. So we take her." "No," Ho-jin's voice was sharp enough that Deok-soo straightened in his chair. "We don't need to take her. We need him to believe we could, at any moment, whenever we choose. Fear does more damage than force ever will. Let him spend every waking hour terrified of losing her. Let it eat him alive. A man distracted by fear makes mistakes, and when he makes his mistake, that's when we move on his territory." "And the woman?" Ho-jin's smile was thin, calculating, entirely without warmth. "The woman is just the key. I have no interest in hurting her unless it becomes necessary." He paused. "Though I suspect Tae-min won't want to test how necessary I'm willing to make it." Back at the estate, 3 days passed in a strange, suspended calm. No further photographs, no further notes, nothing but the quiet tension of 2 people waiting for a blow that hadn't yet landed. Nancy grew restless within the walls of the compound, unused to being confined, unused to guards trailing her even to the garden, but she said nothing, understanding the necessity even as it wore at her. Tae-min, for his part, worked constantly. Calls at all hours, meetings with men whose faces gave nothing away, maps and reports spread across his study desk that he quickly covered whenever she entered. As though shielding her from a world, he refused to let touch her more than it already had. "You don't have to protect me from what you're doing," she told him one evening, finding him hunched over those same papers, dark circles deepening beneath his eyes. "I'd rather know than imagine." He looked up at her, torn, and finally gestured her closer, pulling out the chair beside his own. "Ho-jin runs 3 shipping routes through the western harbor," he explained, tracing a finger along a map she didn't fully understand. "If I can cut his supply lines before he moves against us, I weaken him enough that retaliation becomes too costly for him to risk. It's slow. It's careful. And it's the only way to end this without a war that gets people killed in the streets. And if it doesn't work..." His jaw tightened. "Then I do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Even if that means burning down everything I've built to do it." "Tae-min, I mean it, Nancy." He turned fully toward her, taking her hands in his voice fierce with a conviction that frightened and moved her in equal measure. "I have spent my whole life building an empire I never particularly wanted, inherited from a father who taught me that power was the only thing that mattered, that love was a liability, that anyone who mattered to me was a target waiting to be exploited." His thumb traced circles against her knuckles. "I believed him for 28 years. And then you walked into my conference room and told me my contract had a fatal legal flaw, and you weren't even the slightest bit afraid of me, and something in me that I thought had died with my mother woke back up." Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. "Tae-min, I'm not going to lose you to a man like Ho-jin," he said, low and certain. I'm not going to lose the first good thing I've had in this life because I was too careful, too controlled, too afraid of what loving you might cost me. I've already decided. Whatever it costs, I'll pay it." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, pouring into it every fear she'd swallowed over the past week, every terror of losing him before she'd even fully allowed herself to have him. He kissed her back with equal intensity, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pulling her flush against him as though he could shield her from the entire world through proximity alone. "I love you," she breathed against his lips, the words slipping free before she could stop them, before caution or fear could talk her out of it. "God help me, I love you, and I don't even care how insane that is." Something broke open in his expression, raw, stunned, achingly vulnerable. "Say it again," he murmured. "I love you." He pulled her into his lap without warning, kissing her like a man starving, like a man who'd spent his entire life believing he didn't deserve softness and had just discovered he was wrong. "I love you," he said against her mouth again and again, like he needed to make up for 28 years of never saying it to anyone at all. "I love you, Nancy. I should have said it the night I paid that bill. I think I loved you before I even understood what I was feeling." For a while, wrapped together in the quiet of his study, the war outside felt distant, almost unreal. It wouldn't stay that way. Sukho's voice crackled urgently through the intercom near midnight, shattering the fragile peace. "Sir, you need to see this. Now." Tae-min was on his feet instantly, Nancy right behind him, dread pooling cold in her stomach as they hurried to the security office. On the monitor, grainy footage showed a black sedan idling just beyond the estate's eastern perimeter, the exact gap in coverage Ho Jin's men had mapped days before. "They've been surveilling the eastern wall for 2 hours, Sukho reported, his voice tight. "No movement yet. But sir, that's Deok-soo behind the wheel. Ho Jin's second." Tae-min's expression went utterly, dangerously still. "Get every available man to the eastern perimeter," he said, his voice cold enough that Nancy felt it in her bones. "Nancy stays with me. Nobody gets within 100 meters of her tonight." Nancy grabbed his arm before he could move, her heart hammering. "Tae-min, please, be careful." He turned back, cupping her face for one brief, fierce moment. "I promise you," he said. "This ends tonight, one way or another. And I promise you, whatever happens, you will still be standing here when it's over." Then he was gone, moving through the estate with the lethal precision of a man who had been raised for exactly this moment, and Nancy was left standing in the security office, watching the grainy monitor, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years that his promise would hold. The next hour crawled by in unbearable silence, broken only by static bursts from Sukho's radio and the low murmur of guards moving into position across the monitors. Nancy sat frozen in the security office, arms wrapped around herself, watching shadows shift at the tree line where the black sedan had parked. "They're moving," one of the guards said suddenly, leaning toward the screen. 2 men, east wall, approaching the garden gap. Nancy's stomach lurched. "Where's Tae-min?" "Position 2, Sukho answered without looking away from his own monitor, radio pressed to his ear. "He's 20 meters from the intrusion point." "Tell him to fall back," Nancy said, panic clawing up her throat. "Tell him." "He won't," Sukho said quietly. "Not tonight." On the screen, grainy and green-tinted, Nancy watched 2 figures slip through the gap in the perimeter fence, moving low and fast toward the house. Her heart slammed against her ribs as shapes converged from the shadows. Tae-min's men, closing in from 3 directions at once, silent and coordinated, a trap sprung exactly as planned. The scuffle that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but to Nancy it felt like an eternity. Bodies colliding on grainy footage, radio chatter overlapping and clipped, urgent bursts, and then, abruptly, stillness. 2 intruders secured, Sukho reported, exhaling for what sounded like the first time in an hour. "No casualties. Chairman Yoon is unharmed." Nancy's knees nearly buckled with relief. "He's okay. He's really okay. He's on his way back now." She didn't wait. She was out the door and running through the halls before anyone could stop her, and when she burst out onto the back terrace and saw Tae-min walking up from the garden, jacket torn at the shoulder but otherwise whole, otherwise alive, she didn't think, she just ran to him and threw herself into his arms so hard he staggered back a step. "You're alive," she gasped into his chest, tears she couldn't stop finally breaking free. "You're really alive. I told you I would be." His arms wrapped around her, tight and unshaking despite everything, his lips pressing into her hair. "I told you this would end tonight. Ho-jin. Deok-soo talks fast when he's staring down the barrel of a gun he knows I won't hesitate to use," Tae-min said grimly, pulling back just enough to look at her, hands framing her face the way they always did now, like an anchor. He gave up enough about Ho-jin's operation to end this properly. Not just tonight's threat, the whole war. By morning, Ho-jin's shipping routes will belong to no one. His men will scatter to save themselves, and he'll have nothing left to come after either of us with. "Are you certain?" "I made very certain," he said, and something in his tone told her not to ask further, that some details were better left in the world he navigated and she didn't have to. She searched his face, still trembling from the fear of the past hour, and found nothing there but steady, unwavering devotion. "I was so scared," she admitted. "I thought. I know." He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like a man who'd nearly lost everything and understood, in that moment, exactly what everything meant. "I know, love. I'm sorry you had to be afraid. I promise you, from tonight forward, you will never sit in the dark again, not from a cut power line, and not from fear either. I'll spend the rest of my life making certain of it." 6 weeks later, the war that had threatened to swallow them both had settled into an uneasy but lasting peace. Ho-jin's operation dismantled from within, his territory absorbed quietly into rival hands who had no particular interest in Tae-min or the woman he loved, the Black Rose and the surveillance photographs nothing now but memories neither of them cared to revisit. Nancy stood in the kitchen of the small house Tae-min had bought her, not the towering, guarded estate, but something smaller, warmer, a place with actual sunlight pouring through real windows, chosen specifically because she'd once mentioned, in passing, that she missed having a garden like her mother's back home. "You didn't have to do all this," she told him, watching him fumble, endearingly out of his depth, with a bag of plantains he'd bought at her request and had absolutely no idea how to prepare. "I wanted to," he said simply, the same way he'd said it about the electricity bill all those months ago. "I like taking care of you." She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back, feeling his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her palm. "You already did," she murmured. "The day you paid that bill. I didn't know it yet, but you'd already started taking care of me long before you ever said a word." He turned in her arms to face her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that still, even now, took her breath away. "I'll never stop," he said. "Not for as long as I live." Her phone buzzed on the counter, fully charged, plugged into an outlet that never worried her anymore, in a home with lights that never went dark. She glanced at it, smiling, then back at him. "You know," she said, "when this all started, I thought you were the most dangerous man I'd ever meet. And now I think you're the safest place I've ever been." She rose on her toes and kissed him, slow and certain, no fear left between them, only the quiet, hard-won peace of two people who had fought a war and chosen each other anyway. Electricity bills and all. He laughed against her mouth, a real laugh, rare and warm, the kind she'd learned over the months belonged only to her, and kissed her again, and outside their window, the lights of Seoul glittered on undisturbed, indifferent to the Mafia boss and the woman he'd once saved from the dark, who had, in turn, saved him right back.